Hi, what you're looking at is the chassis assembly from a NuTone N2561 N2562. The unit was sent in by the customer. It needs to be rebuilt. There was some kind of accident with it during some remodeling or something, not exactly sure on the entire story, but it went from playing really well to now it sort of makes a whooshing sound when you turn it on. While it's here to be repaired, we're going to rebuild it at the same time. This is a D chassis. As I've said in a previous video, there are many different chassis versions, and this happens to be a D chassis. D chassis were made probably somewhere between the middle or end of 1966 through the end of around 1968 or so. No one kept exact track of when each chassis version was introduced, so you just have to go with it. Chassis number on the end of it on an ink stamp down here. Each different chassis always has its own unique challenges when you do a rebuild, and D chassis in particular have their own, and it has primarily to do with this big long orange thing right here, which I'm going to turn it around and let you see. But I thought before I do that, I'd show you something else that I found when I took it apart, which I find interesting, amusing, and somewhat annoying. Alright, so before I show you what I found in the set, which I found so amusing and annoying, this is a little bit of electronic component 101 here. What you're looking at are two capacitors. So these are two different styles. This is called an axial capacitor because the leads for it come out of each end like the axles on your car. And this is a radial capacitor. Radial capacitors, both leads come out of one end like this. Axial capacitors are old school capacitors, and for the most part they fell out of favor probably sometime in the late 60s, maybe early 70s for the most part, not in all cases, but generally speaking, yes. And then radial capacitors became sort of the norm. This set was made in 1967. It was fully populated with all axial capacitors when it was brand new at the NuTone factory. This set has been worked on before, and whoever worked on it before didn't do a really good job. And one of the things that they didn't bother to do was when you replace capacitors, if you're working on a piece of equipment that has all axial capacitors, by all standards and for good workmanship and best practices, you replace them with brand new axial capacitors. And yes, these are still available. In fact, if I go over here, here's a bag of axial capacitors that I got in from an order from our component supplier 2 days ago, and this bag contains 100 axial capacitors, all of the same value. We use them for a specific purpose here at the shop, and I like to have a lot of them on hand, and we have lots of other ones in values also. I actually have an individual case full of just axial capacitors. That's what's in here. I guess you can't see that very well. Here are all the axial capacitors. These are all the most common values that we use all the time. And when we have to work on something that has axial capacitors, guess what's put back into them? More axial capacitors. So what do guys do that don't have these and don't bother and don't care? Well, what they do is they take a radial capacitor like this and they sort of splay the leads out sideways so it sort of mimics an axial capacitor, and then they bend the leads down like this and make two little legs out of them, and then they put them like this on the board. Okay, that's bad workmanship. That's not caring about what you do, and also inherently it can create problems. Now, if push came to shove and you had no other choice and you had to get it done and it was time crunch time and the submarine's going to sink if you don't get the radio fixed, okay, you know, like in those World War II movies, then what you do is you take some of this. This is silicone lead dressing. It's a woven cloth tube, and it's impregnated with some kind of silicone material to make it flexible, and it acts as an insulator. So if push came to shove and you got to get the radio fixed, otherwise the submarine's not going to surface and everybody's going to die, you put a little lead dressing on it, if nothing else, to cover up the 3/4 of an inch of lead here that's exposed and all over the inside of the set. At least this way it looks like you made some type of effort to do some kind of proper workmanship on the whole thing. But the other problem with having leads like this is these open wires act as like little antennas inside the set. When you take an axial capacitor like this, if you size it properly, when you bend it over, the leads are like this. Let's see if I can make it so you can see that better. The leads are like this, where they stand up. So the only part that's exposed is right from where it exits the end of the capacitor down to the bottom of the body of the capacitor, and then it sits on the board. The rest of it goes through the circuit board, it's soldered, and the long extra lead is snipped off. The amount of exposed lead here is probably easily 1/10 or 1/8 the amount that you have here. Especially in things like radios and amplifiers and things like that, having a bunch of leads like this all exposed, acting like little antennas, is going to increase the hum and the buzz and the background noise on the set all the time, because it's picking up all kinds of stray stuff. It's not good, it's not right, and it should never be done that way. Unless, of course, you're on a submarine and everybody's going to die. Alright, so now you're looking inside the chassis of the 2561. We're looking at the intercom board right here. And what do we see? Well, what we see are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and down here there's another one, radial capacitors with their leads all bent out like this, sitting on top of the board, acting like little antennas. And it's not right. But wait, it gets worse, at least in my opinion. Down here underneath, where it's a little hard to see, can you see that? Yeah, you can. Right here, this little blue one, that's an axial capacitor. So why did they put in one axial capacitor and then all radials and do it the wrong way on the rest of the board? Beats the heck out of me. And to make it worse, down here, where you can't see, down in the bottom of the board, there's another axial capacitor that's been replaced. So they put in two that are right, but all the rest of them are done wrong. But wait, it gets even worse. So now you're looking at the bottom of the chassis, and underneath this area right here, and underneath this area right here are the big TO3 output transistors for the amplifier. So these are very important parts of the set. All of the wires and everything, these components on here, they're all soldered to these tie strips that they used to use back in the day. It gives you a mounting point. Here's a tie strip right here, and they have these little hoops on them, and the wires go through the hoops and wrap around them. Then you solder everything in place, because that's how old school point-to-point wiring was done. So here we have a radial capacitor that's been scabbed in place of the original axial. It's a little hard to see with the green wire in the way. And what they did here was, instead of desoldering the legs of the original capacitor from the tie strip and then taking it apart and then putting the new ones in, no, they just clipped off the leads of the original capacitor and wrapped the leads of the radial capacitor around it, sort of twisted them together, and then soldered them. Very, very bad. You should never ever do that. Then, to make things even worse, this blue capacitor right here, which goes across to the terminals of the transistor, the power transistor for the amplifier, I should say. So what do we have here? Well, this is an original capacitor. This is a 1967 capacitor. So why did they replace one and not the other one? Well, either because they didn't have one, or because these are tricky to get into. The space is really small. You got this big audio transformer in the way, and it's hard to work on right there. So they probably said, oh, to hell with it. We don't want to do that. It's good enough. Should be all right. And said it was fine. So, not good. Bad workmanship. You'd be surprised all the things I see. So let's get on with our original story. In rebuilding a D chassis like this, you have this big orange capacitor right here, and right next to it on the other side, where you can't see yet, there's another matching one just like it. And these are about the size of a double size M80 that you might blow up on the 4th of July. The problem with this type of design when it's time to rebuild this is, sitting on top of the two orange capacitors is this little circuit board here, and this is the primary power supply and rectifier board. It's the board that the power from the remotely mounted transformer feeds into. It has some filtering capacitor on it, has one here. Oh wait, and that's the wrong kind also. So this board is screwed to this little metal bracket right here, and the little metal bracket is shaped to accommodate the big round cylinder capacitors here, and then there's two screws that go through the end, and that kind of sandwiches it all together and holds it inside the chassis. Because the orange capacitors are the primary power supply capacitors, they absolutely have to be replaced because they're well beyond their expected lifespan, and also they are the highest quality cardboard capacitors that you could get in 1967, so I'm surprised they lasted as long as they did, seeing how that is 52 years ago when this was all put together. The challenge here is that while these have to be replaced, they don't make capacitors this size any longer in this kind of value. They just don't really exist anymore. Everything has become smaller and smaller and smaller. So the challenge here is they have to be replaced. There's no real good place to put them, and this all has to be securely mounted back into the chassis so it's not all flopping around in the breeze when you send it back to the customer and they reinstall it. I'm going to show you, I'm not going to do a step-by-step, but I'm going to take it all apart and let you see what it looks like when it's apart, and then I'm going to explain what we're going to do, and then you get to see it when it's all done. So let's take this apart. For those of you who have been paying close attention, this is now upside down because it makes it easier for you to see, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to untake the two screws out of the end that hold our capacitor and power supply sandwiched together. And we'll see if we can get the screws out. If they had made them 2 turns longer, it would always have been easier. Alright, there we go. So we have these 2 long screws. We're going to save those in our cup like we always do. And then we're going to pull out our big orange capacitors, and if you look very carefully, we have another surprise. So what do we have inside here? Now this, I'm sure, was done by the fella who did all of the axial capacitors, and he faced the same challenge that I face today, which is how do we replace these and make it all fit back together into the chassis. And apparently what he decided to do was put some new capacitors down inside the tubes and then wire them up to the original wires, and then he filled them all up with silicone. How about that? Now that is moderately ingenious, but not really the best way to go. At least he did make some kind of an effort. So let's cut one of these open. This isn't what I expected to find. I expected these just to be basically original. So we're going to cut these open and let's see what's inside. And it's not silicone, it's hot glue. And it's a little hard to get apart. Maybe it's probably not going to come apart all the way because there's so much glue. But what you can see here is these green, these are radial capacitors. I can't tell you the values, I don't think, because the hot glue is kind of in the way. They are 470 microfarad at 50 volts, which is close to what they're supposed to be, but not really exactly right. And then we'll cut this one open. And what do we have in here? We have a 2200 at 35, which is, again, not really what it's supposed to be. So I'll give the fellow, whoever did this, I'll give him 2 points for ingenuity because he figured out how to mount them, but he loses 1.5 points for putting in the wrong values. So our original values were supposed to be the one big capacitor, which I'll sort of hold it back together since we cut it apart here, was there were 2 capacitors inside the orange tube. One of them was 1000 microfarad at 15 volts, and the other one was 1500 microfarads at 15 volts. And the way this was originally wired up when the set was made, these two were joined together to give you 2500 microfarad at 15 volts. 2500 microfarads is not the same as 2200. 2200 is 300 microfarads less, which is enough to make a difference. And it's not appropriate to go smaller with the size, your total capacitance in a capacitor. Going up slightly is okay, going down, never a good choice. In the other orange tube, if we kind of hold this back together, I don't know if we have enough pieces to actually show it, because I did a good job of mangling it up. Kind of like that will work. Yeah, it's close. There were two inside. They were both 500 microfarad at 35 volts, and they were wired up independent of each other, so it was acting like two capacitors in one big orange tube. So what are we going to do with this? Well, what we're going to do is, because I would never have done what he did, and I would never try to reuse the orange tubes, because there's a better way to do this, because this is too messy. What we're going to do is, we're going to, at the end, and you get to see it when it's all done, this power supply board, this part, too many things in the way. Alright, so this board right here on the bracket is ultimately going to sit back in here against the chassis like this, and then we're going to use some plastic standoffs, and then we're going to make another little circuit board that's going to sit over it. The standoffs are going to raise it above this one to stay out of the way of all the other components, and then we will use some screws and put the screws back through the holes in the end. They'll go back into the bracket, and the whole thing will sit right here in this spot. The amount of space we have is limited because when the set is all put back together, the speaker cone has to sit back in the opening here, and the speaker cone takes up a lot of the space that you see here. You think, oh, he's got all kinds of space in there, but he really doesn't, because you've got to put a speaker cone back in there too. So it's all got to be out of the way of the speaker cone. The other rule on something like this is you absolutely, definitely do not want to do something where you just wire things onto the ends of wires and then you bend them around in there and then you put some wire ties and it's kind of held onto the back of the speaker flopping around like this. None of that is any good. It's got to be secure, it's got to be held in place, and it's got to be good enough to last like another 25 years. So if you do it properly, we'll be able to achieve that. So when I'm done rebuilding the set and making my board and getting it all put back together, I'll let you see what it looks like. Back in a while. Hi, I'm back. So some time has passed, and now our 2561-62 is almost complete and ready to be put back together and put back in its case. But I wanted to show you what I did before I closed it up, because once you put the speaker back in the front of the chassis, it'll be really hard to see. If you remember, we had our two kind of nasty orange capacitors, and they were mounted against this part of the chassis with the plate that holds the power supply board on top of it, and then there were screws that went in on the end, and that sort of squeezed it all together into sort of a capacitor sandwich, and that's how the whole thing was held in place. So we got rid of our orange capacitors, and in their place what I've made is this circuit board here, this little tan board. And what this is, simply, it's a piece of project board that you can buy almost anywhere nowadays. On that, I've installed 3 capacitors to replace the 2 orange capacitors that were originally mounted against the chassis. So we have the big one here, which is the proper 2500 microfarad, which replaces one of the big orange capacitors. And then we have the 2 small ones. These are each 500 microfarad, and they replace the second one, which was a 2-section capacitor at 500 microfarad each. So this is a replacement for the 2 orange ones. And then you have to do a little bit of rewiring because some of the wires are too short and you don't want to have them stretched and pulled. So we just used some standard wire here, some stranded wire, and we soldered it into the proper connection points on the board that I made, and then wired it back into the power supply board and some other points on the chassis where all of those belong. Our little in-shop built replacement circuit board is then mounted on two nylon standoffs. There's one up here and one down over on the other side, and they have screws that go through them, and then they go through the mounting holes in the original power supply board and into the mounting screw locations on the power supply bracket assembly, and that's again sort of squeezes it all together and holds it in place. And then we use some new shorter screws through the end of the chassis to hold the mounting bracket in place, and now we have our replacement board, and as you can see, it's nice and sturdy. It's not flopping around in the breeze or anything like that. You notice a complete lack of wire ties and duct tape and things like that because that's not really the right way to do it. And this is a shallow enough profile that I can easily take the speaker cone. This is 2561s use it's a little hard to see, use a 6x9 speaker cone, and it's kind of a shallow depth. It's not a real deep speaker cone, and this will easily fit back in the chassis just like it did originally, and none of this will interfere with the metal frame of the speaker cone, so it's all done properly. And these parts are certainly much better quality than what the original ones even were, and the original ones probably lasted 35 or 40 years. So this is a type of proper modification and the repair that will last the unit a really long time. The other thing I did while I had it apart was we talked about all of the incorrect style of capacitors. So there's the remains of our orange capacitors, which you saw me cut apart previously. We'll get all this out of here. See, these are some of the original wires from the original capacitor connections. These are all too short, so they've been replaced. And then while I was in there, I replaced all of the incorrect style radial capacitors that someone had added to the set. I also took out the two axial capacitors that were left over that I pointed out that whoever worked on it before didn't change. I took those out and replaced them. So all the capacitors have been replaced. There's new lamps in place. And then the other thing I found, because yes, I've already had this hooked up and played it and tested it to make sure it worked properly. This is the Master Station speaker volume control assembly. It would be this one right here. And you notice this one is silver. These are all aluminum. This is brass because this is a replacement one from a donor unit because there's a problem with this one. This volume control, someone has had a go at this because I think they forced some kind of grease into it because it's got this greasy stuff coming out of it. I suppose I could take it apart and take a look since it's kind of shot at this point. But the problem with this one is if you turn it lower than maximum volume, as soon as you go off maximum volume just a little bit, the sound cuts out and you don't get any lower volume than that. So it's not really working as a volume control. Since I've got it out and since I said it's got grease in it, let's open it up and see what we got. Alright, so here's a close-up of our volume control. Now, what I'm going to say before I do this is you should not do this at home. These type of volume control assemblies, and almost all types of volume control assemblies, they're not designed to be taken apart once they're manufactured. You'll notice that this is held together by these little metal tabs that are bent over. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 little metal tabs. They come off the back case of the volume control, and when this was manufactured it was all assembled, and then a person or some type of machine bent these over to hold the whole thing together. The problem with unbending the tabs is most of the time when you unbend them, at least one of them is going to break off, because they're not really designed to be bent and unbent and bent again, because all the bending back and forth simply makes them break off. Now, I do know people that will tell you, oh no, the only way you can really do this, the only way you can clean it properly is to take it all apart, and I'm here to tell you that that's a real dangerous thing to do, because it actually requires all 4 tabs be bent over properly to hold it together because it's the force of the whole thing being held together by the tabs that keeps it working properly. And if you unbend them like I'm doing now, see if you can see that, you might get them unbent, and you have to use something like small needle-nose pliers to straighten them out, otherwise you'll never get the thing apart. And you might feel lucky if you get them all unbent, and then you take it apart, and there's the inner part, and it does appear that someone has put possibly some type of greasy substance inside of this, because I think that there's a lot more greasy buildup. This could be original right there on the end of the screwdriver, but I'm not at all certain that it is. It seems to be oozing out all over the place, which is not how this normally would be. So I don't recommend you take these apart. We only did this one because it's bad. The problem is once you take it apart and then you clean it all thoroughly and you re-lubricate it, and yes, there are greases and dielectric jellies that you can use to lubricate things like this, but I don't recommend you take these apart. If you break it and you ruin it, then you got to try to find a replacement, and that's not always as easy as you think. So the other problem is once you take it apart, you clean it all out, you feel real good about what you did, and then you've got to hold it down and try to bend the tabs back. And sometimes you get lucky, you might get them all bent back on. But if you break one off, then it's sort of like that quarter of the volume control assembly isn't going to be held together firmly, and then when you rotate it, it's going to lift off the base like this. Maybe that's exaggerated, but same basic idea. And then you're going to lose the connection inside, and then it's not going to work right. So I don't really recommend that you do this. This would be the method of last resort. See, we didn't break any off that time, but I consider that to be lucky. You can't figure that just because this time it worked out okay, that every time it would. Because if you do break it, then what are you going to do? Where are you going to find a replacement? Not as easy as people think, especially if it's an ultra rare volume control from a model that's not plentiful for spare parts. You don't want to risk it. There's other ways things can be cleaned. Our N2561, N2562 has been reassembled. It's back in its gold faceplate. I cleaned the knobs, and the last thing I'm going to do before I put it back in the tub to take it back to the office is I'm going to work on this grill area a little bit. And one of the things you can do with a set like this is the black parts of it get kind of faded over time. It starts to look a little bit shabby. Now, when I had this one apart, I washed all of this, and that gets a lot of the dirt and dust and stuff out of the louvered areas and everything. As I've said in other videos, you have to be really careful with the gold finished ones, because the gold finish is applied over the more standard silver finish. If you work too hard on the gold finish, and especially if you run it under hot water, which you don't ever want to do, the gold finish can sort of dissolve and float away, and you end up with a silver Master Station. So you have to be really careful of that. What I like to do with this is, and this is a really simple thing that anybody can do, there are a lot of different automotive products that you can buy. The one I like is this. This is Poor Boy's World Natural Look, safely cleans and restores, and UV protection, leather, vinyl, plastic, tires, and more. It's sort of your general purpose Armor All-y kind of stuff. This is not Armor All, this is another brand. This is the kind I like to use. I use this on my cars. And what you can do is you can simply take an old toothbrush, and you can put a little bit of this on the toothbrush. I don't recommend that you spray it on the master directly, because you don't want it running down on the inside. And we'll see if you can see this. And what you want to do, the tricky part about this is you have to get it in the louvers. You don't want it just on the top so much. And you very lightly go back and forth like this. And we'll just do a small section here. And this is very much like what you probably put on maybe the dash of your car, or on your tires, or on your door panels. And it helps sort of darken it up. It doesn't take a lot. and it doesn't take a lot of time to do it. And I think you can see this area here is the part I already did. You can let it sit for a while, and then you simply use a rag and sort of buff it off. And what it does is it helps darken up the black, sort of deepens it up, makes it look better. It gets rid of some of the faded look that it has. It's a simple thing to do. It takes like 5 minutes to do the whole thing. It improves the way it looks a great deal, and it's a really good thing to do. The other thing I did on this unit was, and I've showed this on other videos, I took when the knobs were all off, I soaked the knobs in some of the orange citrus cleaner, and that softens up all of the residue that gets in the grooves on the knobs. It's mostly stuff from your skin and your oils and fingers, and you use a brass bristle brush and you use it to brush in the direction of the grooves to get the crud out of it. And then what I do is I use this stuff, same thing, and I put them all in a rag and I spray it all over them and fold it up and let it sit overnight, and it sort of gets into the black of the knobs and it helps improve how it looks. And it's just little things you can do like that to sort of spruce it all up for the customer, so what they get back looks much better than what they started with. This is sort of final testing now. I have it set up on a standard bench set up for testing. It's powered by one of our in-shop made power transformers because it's heavier duty than the original one is. I have it hooked up to an AM and an FM antenna, and I have it hooked up to a single remote station and a door station over there like always. One of the unique things about the 2561 is, while it is a loop run and home wired system, entry door stations can actually be wired to the back of any remote station. They go on the black and black-white wire connections, and that's how I have this made up because it's just easier that way. So that's fine like that. And we'll go ahead and play the radio for a few seconds. We have AM.
Data. Many of them continue to slam Trump for not releasing his returns
and
during
we
his
have
2016 run for president. Inauthentic.
You can see that our master speaker volume.
Some misrepresented themselves as local.
We'll turn this one down. Master speaker volume now works.
My H&R block is coming. Time to file may be running out.
On its full range as it should. Our function switch here, normally these are left in the center radio intercom position. However, we can put it on monitor, which is to the right. And sounds from this speaker are coming out of that speaker over there. That's why we have feedback. And then you also have standby, which is the position to the left. Standby is what later became an intercom only setting. The standby is music is in standby, but the intercom still works. So, for instance, we'll turn the radio back on.
Healthcare guide. It's a quick
and if we turn this to standby, and we turn that one down, it's now no radio here, but the intercom still works. So we have inside, talk and listen, and outside. Outside is our entry door stations, talk and listen. So we have inside talk. We have to turn this up. Comes out from over there, and listen. And you can hear the reply. So this system has what later would have been called hands-free reply from the master, because you have talk and listen here. And then we have the same thing. We have door talk. Comes out of the door speaker over there, and door listen. Sorry about all the feedback, but that's the world of intercoms. So that all works well. We have the same functions on our remote stations. We can turn it up and hear the radio.
Southbound 880 for
we
the
have monitor. And we can put it in standby, which would be intercom only. And then we have outside or door talk and door listen and inside talk. And then there is no inside listen like there is on the master, but there is a position that's called special listen, and special listen is often misunderstood. So if you move the lever to special listen, you don't hear anything. See, doesn't do anything, it seems like, but it actually does. The idea behind special listen is if a station is on standby, like if we put the master station on standby, and then you move the lever to special listen, it picks up the sounds from the master station and it comes out through all the remote stations. So it's kind of a unique feature on this model. Since all of this is done through wiring and switches, it's not as sophisticated as models that they made in the 80s where these functions are all done electronically. But for when it originally came out in 1961, it's pretty good. So we have a nicely reworked and refurbished N256162. It's going to go back to the customer before the end of the week, and I'm sure he's anxious to get it back. It turns out that he's got like 11 or 12 stations in his house, and he misses having it because they use it all the time. He's got a bunch of kids, I think, and they use it instead of yelling at each other, which is how it's supposed to be used. I hope you found this interesting and perhaps helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up on YouTube, because that always helps. There'll be a banner right here that shows you how to subscribe. Go to our YouTube homepage, click on the bell or on the wheel, put in your email address, and every time we post a new video, you'll get a notification and you can watch it. That's all for today. See you on the next video.